Okay.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Libby Book Club for WA. I'm your host, David Allen Patali, and my guest tonight is Andrea Thompson. Andrea, welcome, and it's fabulous to have you to speak about your wonderful book, Geraldine, from Fremantle Press.
Hey, David. And look, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the chat tonight. It's going to be so much fun.
Absolutely. Now, before we dive in, just like to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting to you tonight from the traditional lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, as always, this is a chat between Andrea and I, but it's also a chat with all of you. So if you have questions, please dive into the chat and I'll do my best to weave them in. And we're just going to have a lovely booky chat because I read the other day that we're coming up to the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, the shortest day of the year. It's perfect reading weather. Andrea, I have spent the last couple of weeks devouring your words. Every evening, rain pattering on the window. Geraldine is a story that transports you to another time, another place, to many different countries, but we follow one extraordinary person. Can you tell us a bit about Geraldine and the person, and also Geraldine, the book? What's it all about?
Yeah, David, absolutely. Look, Geraldine is the most amazing woman. She's strong, she's determined, she's obstinate, um, and she is someone who changes the circumstances of her life and her world through her very existence. She's someone who knows herself from a very early age. I think she's also kind of hilarious.
Mm.
She does some really funny and some really dumb things along the way as well. But she's a survivor and a thriver, and she is the most beautiful woman, I think. The book itself came about. Um, I started writing an autobiography, a memoir, because I'm terribly interesting, don't you know? And I spent about 5 years between things messing around with bits and pieces of, what I thought were chapters of this memoir. And I'd write them and then I'd read them back later that day or the next day or in the next few days. And I would have the same experience over and over again. What I was doing was writing prose. And I've stolen this, of course, but it was prose so wooden it was a fire hazard. It was just really boring and dull and dreadful. And then a couple of years ago, I went to a seminar, a workshop on writing. And blow me down if every single person in that room wasn't also working on a memoir. And
Yeah.
I'm nothing if not a contrarian. So I walked out of that workshop determined to change track. And the very next day, I started writing what became Geraldine. And of course, I had a lot of content to draw on. But as Geraldine emerged as a character, she grew into this really strong, really powerful being with this incredible voice. And she then stole my life and said, oh, I'll have that, and I'll have that. But we'll make it funny or interesting or purposeful or sad or happy or whatever. And somehow the prose came to life in a way that I never could when I thought I was writing about myself. So yeah, that's how it became.
And I particularly love the back of the novel, the story of a woman who changes the world that wants to change her. Now, Geraldine's
Yeah,
a gender diverse person, so she's
indeed.
someone who, from the very earliest of ages, she knows exactly who she is.
Yep.
However, this world of ritual, this world of rules and laws and regulations and rubbing along the right way constantly questions and challenges her. But Geraldine has this, this iron spine, this obstinance. Uh, what is it about Geraldine that allows her to keep on this track, to know who she is from the beginning?
Well, I think you've hit the nail right on the head there, David. It's her self-knowledge.
Mm.
And I wrote this character because she's true. And I wrote her because she demanded her story be told. But as a gender diverse woman, and people, there are misconceptions about this, but there are misconceptions about everything and everyone. Gender diverse people aren't unique in being misunderstood. We're just, the same as everyone else. No one gets anyone else really at their core. But the idea that, somehow people at some point in their life decide that they're not the gender they were assigned at birth, and then they go through this process of transition, and then they, and then they, and then they. That's kind of rubbish. It's a societal stereotype. So I really wanted to reflect Geraldine as someone who knew themselves from the very beginning. And one of the very earliest scenes is Geraldine looking on at her mother in a hospital before she's even properly conceived. And I wrote that for two reasons. I wrote that because, for whatever reason and however it happened, that's one of my earliest memories. But I also wrote it because I wanted people to know that she was born herself and she was conceived herself and she has always been herself. And that's a really important part of this narrative, because it explodes the myth that somehow people, at some point in their lives decide, oh, I'm not that, I'm this. And then they transition. And I just think that that's, like I said, it's a societal stereotype. It's a bit of a myth. It's an easy explainer for people who maybe, don't have any experience or knowledge or understanding, and that's okay. But it's not really accurate.
Yeah. I must say, I really related. I've got two kids, and one of the hardest lessons not hard, but surprising lessons was it's factory settings. There is nothing that I can guide, but that whole nature versus nurture thing. It's like, no, 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 they are exactly who they are
Yeah.
from the beginning. And I was hooked on Geraldine from how you started that way. But it was,
Oh,
this is it. Yeah.
thank you. And look, I have a son of my own. He's 34. And yeah, I learned very quickly that he is and always was and always will be exactly who he is. And my job as his parent is to support him in being the best version of himself that he can be. And yeah, that's worked really nicely.
Andrea, we've already got some lovely questions in the chat. I just wanted to say as well, we have a copy of Geraldine that's going to be signed by Andrea tonight, and that will be
This very copy here, with this very pen, to the winner of, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be like, say, the most interesting question, the one that sparked the most chat. So now JP has a lovely question. So, hi, I love the book and I love the character Geraldine. I love that she just knew who she was and was so straightforward in telling people. My child is gender diverse, and Geraldine as a child reminded me a lot of my kid. The book was so heartbreaking at times, but also very optimistic. I would love to know what you hope readers would take away from this book.
Oh, JP, that's a wonderful question. And look, thanks for reading Geraldine, and thanks for being on this, what is it, a webinar? This chat, this talk.
Yeah. Bookie chat.
Look, this is, when I talked to Frio Press about the marketing of it, I said, look, I'm not backing away from the content of the book. It's a really queer book because I'm a really queer person and love all of that. But I asked for them to make sure it was marketed as a mainstream book because I think this is a story that anyone can enjoy. And what I hope people will take away from it has been expressed in some of the reader reviews online, where people have said the sorts of things like, this is not the sort of book I would normally have read, but I'm so glad that I read it because I can really relate to this story. And hey, all of those weirdo people that I thought were really strange, well, they're just normal like me, aren't they? Because we're all strange, we're all weirdos. And so I just want people to, and look, when people first asked me what the book's about in the early days, I just used to say, I don't know, it's a story about an ordinary woman doing ordinary things. And I just want people to see Geraldine as ordinary because, she exists in this world. And yeah, she does ordinary things, sometimes extraordinary things, but don't we all? So yeah.
That particular word ordinary, I've got a question about that because that comes up a lot in your writing away from Geraldine, but this notion of I'm just an ordinary woman.
Yep.
And Geraldine does, like, as you say, does extraordinary things, but it's that ordinariness, that individuality that, this isn't that big a deal. Just leave her alone and let her do what she's doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, and that's my ambition for my life. I just want people to see me as an ordinary woman and, stop thinking I'm remarkable in any way, because no more remarkable than anyone else. And of course, that's a jab at society's general lack of understanding of gender diversity. And of course, there are some elements of society, politicians, for example, who, love to ride on minorities and use them as scapegoats for things. And gender diversity gets a pretty good sort of run in that side of things. I just want to be unremarkable like everyone else. We are all diverse.
Yeah.
We are all, have our oddities. So I just live my life in the mainstream and get on with stuff, and it works. It works okay. But there are a lot of people I know who are gender diverse who have different experiences because society tends to want to exclude difference. Doesn't matter what the difference is. We just tend to like to go for the 66% either side of the mean. And the outliers get excluded for whatever reason. And I just want, I just want to live an ordinary life, just like Geraldine does. But I want to do extraordinary things, just like everyone else does. Yeah.
But Geraldine also does some pretty extraordinary things and goes to a lot of amazing places. But uh, a sort of throughput is the exploration of prejudice and the way that prejudice is expressed. Uh, Often she meets people who aren't prejudiced against her, who do accept her for who she is, but there are also people who don't.
Yep.
But I quite enjoyed that it's a societal depiction of prejudice. Are people on their own okay, but then when you get them in a group, that's when you can get problems coming through? Or you
Yeah, look, I
can,
think the group think can be problematic at times. I mean, like you bump into individuals who are, kind of don't get it. But when you talk to people one on one, they really want to know. They're like, oh, you're one of those. Okay, tell me about that. Um, and they really try hard to sort of see from a different perspective. But I know it's difficult to break out of your own worldview. But yeah, one on one, small groups, and in the main, let's not be too pessimistic about this because I don't think there's any reason for it. In the main, society is very accepting and very embracing. So I have had moments, as Geraldine did, where people reject or you know deliberately take on something. But that's a rarity. That's not the norm. That's not the norm. So I guess when I'm pushing the idea of wanting to be ordinary, it's at that societal level, and it's at that political level, it's at that medical level, it's at all the places where difference is not honoured because our society and our systems are not set up to deal with difference. They're just not. So it's not even a deliberate thing. It's just that that's how society works, and I can see why because it's a resource thing. But it is what it is.
Andrew, Geraldine lives quite a full life in the sense that it's 1965 to I think about 2003.
Yeah, round about that.
Yeah. So back to sort of what you were saying earlier about the book being marketed in a mainstream way. How would you classify Geraldine? Because is it historical? Is it because this is the thing? People ask me, "What are you reading?" I'm Geraldine. What's it about? It's just a good story.
It's
It's
just
a
a
story
story.
about a person. Like
But
it
I,
was.
I, laughed when you asked that question,
Yeah.
David, because I was reading or I saw it was, I don't know, featured or something somewhere online, and they classified it, right? And so the first classification was LGBT plus fiction, and I thought, yeah, okay, fair, cool. And then I read historical fiction, and I'm like, what the,
Yeah.
I'm not history,
There
I'm
was a
go on.
scandal going on. Yeah.
And then I spoke to one of the marketing people at Frio Press, and they said, "Oh yeah, anything before 1980 is historical fiction."
Historical.
I'm like,
Wow.
okay,
Yeah.
good to know. I and this sounds highfalutin, so I'm happy for people to shoot me down, but I've always sort of thought of it as literary fiction.
Indeed. Indeed.
It's a story. It's not a thriller. It doesn't have sort of deliberate sleight of hand to take you away from the main thing. It's just a story that I hope people will be enticed into and enjoy and read and be enriched afterwards for reading it. So and when I was writing, I had this book on my desk when I was
Oh,
writing.
brilliant. Oscar and Lucinda. Yeah.
Because I wanted to go for his type of really dumb, stupid, magical realism.
Yes.
Where really odd things can happen, but it
Yeah.
all feels so incredibly hyper real. And the other creator that I had in mind was the film director Ken Loach, who the English film director. And I remember as a kid, when I was at school, I can't remember if it was at school or somewhere else, but it was at the time when I was, primary schoolish in England. And I saw the film Kes, which was one of his first films, and God,
Yeah.
that was so compelling. But he was one of the creators of the kitchen sink movement. So, focusing on telling stories that were very, very ordinary. And so I wanted to do that too. I wanted, Geraldine to be really a matter of fact sort of tale without it being dull. And I hope I've managed to reach that sort of balance between this crazy, crazy stuff, from having a little furry animal that appears every time she tries to die, for example,
Yeah.
to this just being this kitchen sinker about a normal person living a normal life.
Andrew, I've got a question that links pretty well to that, actually, from Jay. She says, also love this book. I felt it could have been a memoir about so many things: coming to Australia, the music industry, social constructions of gender. And for much of the book, this was in the background. Did it always have all of these elements? And how was it to bring them all together? Because yeah, there's a lot in Geraldine. There's a lot happening, but it's always very neat. Yeah.
Yeah, look, and thank you, Jay. I think neat's a good word. I don't know if I tried to be neat. I have to say, at a point in the writing, Geraldine took on a life of her own, and I was writing for her and with her, but I wasn't writing her myself. And that sounds really strange, but David, you're probably aware of this, and other writers too. And I know there are probably other writers online as well. When you sort of tap into the creative stream, or this creative stream taps into you, something happens that's a little bit magical. And so I know that Geraldine brought a voice to the novel that I could never have brought to it without her. And she is the focus that ties all of these elements together. Now, it doesn't hurt that she also stole from my geography, my timeline, and from a lot of the things that happened to me. So, the bit about, and spoiler alert for those people who haven't read it, but the bit where she's at Glastonbury and the pyramid stage takes off because she was at Glastonbury. That was one of my experiences. And she's like, I'm having that. And we also lost our tent. And I don't know what we did for 3 days, but we pitched our tent and then never found it until it was time to go home again. There were some weird sort of things that she stole and threaded together, but that character draws on, my experiences, but she is herself entire, and she's the element that threads it all together and makes it all neat and tidy.
Andrew, something I very much enjoyed is your voice, and particularly the humor.
Mm-hmm.
There are many dark moments in Geraldine. There are many confronting scenes, but throughout it, there's this the voice that you use. It's like telling the reader to stick with it. It's going to be okay, and there's a magnanimity to it, a wisdom almost. It's not a self-deprecating kind of humor. It's a very like, yeah, it's a wise kind of humor. Was that something you had to work on, or did that come naturally, or was it something that you had to come to in the writing of Geraldine?
God, I don't know if I have a definitive answer for that question. I think it played out through Geraldine. I mean, I certainly find life to be more comedy than tragedy, although I've never watched a comedy that was actually funny either. Because comedy isn't about laughing, comedy is about
Oh,
showing how absurd life is
yeah,
and
suffering.
making you laugh at the absurdity. Um, so the comedy was always there, and it came fairly easily. And there were some bits that I giggled about while I was writing them because they were just plain stupidly funny. Um, but it offsets the difficulties. Someone who I met who had read the book said to me that she thought it was very dignified. And I said to her, really? I said, because it covers some really, really dark things. And she said, yeah, but you did it in a really dignified way. And I said, thank you, I'll take that. And it does deal with some really difficult things. But I tried to trust the reader in writing those. So I tried not to overwrite them because I trusted that the reader would be able to take the cues that I'd given them and construct whatever they needed to construct around those things, from not really realizing what had happened, to all the way through to going, oh, wow, she just got abused sexually by her teacher at boarding school.
Yeah.
Because you could read that part and it could pass you by if that's not been part of your life experience or part of someone else's life experience. Or you could read and think, oh my God, thank you for not going into all of the detail of that because it was totally unnecessary. So the humor is there because it offsets the reality of life, but it also is at the core of the reality of life. And so I feel like it came fairly easily. And I feel like it was sort of put on the table by me. And then Geraldine said, okay, I'm going to burnish that for you and we'll make it properly funny, darling, because, nice try, but this is how it really needs to sound. So, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, a sort of intrinsic part of Geraldine is that she's an individual, and I really enjoyed also. This is a celebration of individuality. It's not necessarily about, you're finding your place in the world, that kind of thing, but it's also being true to yourself. So later on in the narrative, Geraldine becomes, the accidental, face, if you will, of a rights movement, kind of reluctantly, but then really embraces it.
Yeah.
Is that playing with that? Was that an interesting way to do? It wasn't just that Geraldine was just jumping in, boots and all. It was, hang on, no, I'm me myself first, and I'm trying to do my thing. And there was
Well,
that tension.
yeah. And look, that happened because she wanted to do something to foreground queer people
Mm.
and to give queer people safe places to congregate and to enjoy themselves, because at the time she was doing that, that was, there was danger in that,
Yeah.
still is to some degree. And, so she went to places where she thought she would be safe in, setting up those opportunities. And the rejection pushed her to something a bit more extreme. And once she'd started down that path, the bastions of society, the police and the politicians began to interfere in her life and her ambition. And the more they did that, the more she pushed against them.
Mm.
But it was a deliberate as well as an accidental thing, because as throughout her whole life, she always expected to be accepted and to say, when she knocked on a door, to have the door opened. And when that door wasn't open for her, she's
Yeah.
like, okay, well, I'll do something. And then she did something very subversive. And that was deliberate because it appealed to her, sense of contrariness. And it just kind of snowballed from there.
The part my father-in-law actually went to a boarding school in Rhodesia. He was at
Oh,
church.
okay.
So, and he
And
tells me,
he's
yeah, he survived. Tells me about it. He just tells me about how lonely he was and how often the younger kids were the loneliest. He went there at the age of 6 or 7, but
yeah,
that part was very, very arresting. In that these are kids far away from home, and the only thing they have really is routine and
yep.
tradition and rules. And if you stay within that, technically you'll be okay. But someone like Geraldine who goes into that someone who's got a real idea of herself, that did not mesh at all.
No. And she thought nothing of leaving that place
Mm.
in the center of, in the very middle of Africa. And again, spoiler alert, the really critical part of those chapters are that they didn't see a single wild animal in all the time they were roaming the countryside. And I'll leave people to figure that out for themselves. But for me, it was really important, and that there was a truth behind that anyway. But for me, it was really important that people knew that part of it. Not that they were safe in any way, because they were very unsafe. The wildest of animals were the people who picked them up while they were hitchhiking.
Yeah.
Africa at that time was a country full of very high quality recreational drugs. And one of the people who picked them up, they were lucky to survive that ride. Let's put it that way. Um, so they thought nothing of leaving that place because it wasn't right for them. That was Geraldine and her brother Harry. And Yeah, I think that that kind of is indicative of who Geraldine is, because even at the age of 6, she's like, yeah, okay, we can do this.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to the editor of the book because there was a scene where Geraldine decided which way they would go. And he said, no, no, she's too young for that. And I acceded to, his feedback. So I gave those lines to Harry.
Mm.
But the reality was that it was always Geraldine who was making the decisions, even at that young age. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about Harry, but first, I've got a question here from Christina. She's saying an amazing book and I absolutely loved it. I wanted to ask about Geraldine's neighbors in Zambia. They accepted her immediately as Geraldine, and I wondered if that was an important part of Geraldine's confidence in herself.
Yeah, look, thank you, Christine, and thank you for reading the book. And I'm glad you enjoyed it. So, and again, that there's reality in that. So and they weren't neighbours because they were in the local neighbourhood, but they were like Zambia at that time was an independent country, but it was still very segregated along post-colonial lines. So, white people were supreme, and the people who were the original First Nations people were secondary and subjugated. It was the most awful setup. But Susan and her family and friends just embraced Geraldine for who she was. And they asked one time, are you a Boana or a madam? Are you a man or a woman or a boy or a girl? And that was it. After that, it was like totally unremarkable. Okay. And, they also embraced this white person. And they had no good reason to do that because, they were the next generation of the oppressed in their own country. The British, as they have done right across the world, did terrible, terrible things in Africa and in Zambia. But they still had the beauty in their hearts to say, well, this is just another human being. And, we're going to share ourselves and our love and our food and our hospitality with this person. So there was one moment where they said, okay, well, who are you? And once they got through that, it was like totally unremarkable.
And back to Harry, because Harry's great. But JP's asking, says, I love that she had her brother. Do you think she will ever find Harry again? Because, of course,
I'm going to go into real life here now, okay? Because Harry's based on my older sibling. And his name is Gary with 2 R's. And when I sent him a copy of the book because he lives in Spain, I said, oh, now I know why they gave you 2 R's in your name, because Harry Gary. um, so I did not see, hear from, speak to, or know of my brother Gary for 30 years. And for about 15 of those 30 years, we thought he was dead. And I have another sibling who encouraged us in the belief because he lived quite a marginal life. He was, most likely in the family to be a bank robber, let's say, and those sorts of things. I mean, he lives a very, ordinary life now, but he did live quite a marginal life for quite a while. My other sibling encouraged us to believe that he was propping up a motorway overpass somewhere in Spain, having been done in by the gangsters that he used to hang out with, which is hilarious, but really sad all at the same time. We came across him again 30 years later by accident. And then after that, we reconnected, of course, through the magic of the internet. And then I went to visit him. And it was like one of these true Hollywood stories. We saw each other at the airport and we met and hugged, and it was like we'd never been apart. And so when I was writing Geraldine, I was tempted to draw on that closure there. And I thought, no, I can't do that because no one would ever believe it. They'd say, okay, sorry, you've gone too far now. You've stretched our disbelief just that little bit too far. So I left it out. So does Harry and Geraldine ever reconcile? I don't know. But Andrea and Gary did. And there's a beauty in that. So maybe there's hope for Geraldine and Harry as well.
I suppose, Andrea, a literary question off the back of that, then, in that, they say truth is stranger than fiction. You were a journalist for a very long time, so you were reporting on real things. But the moment we put a label of fiction on something, we can explore a bit more. What is stranger, fiction or reality? Or in maybe stranger in the sense that what can you do more with?
Is there any difference between the two?
Yeah.
So I'm a music journalist. I was never a, sort of hard sort of news journalist. And so music journalism is all about stretching reality and making myth at its best, I think, anyway. And I've talked to a lot of up and coming bands who have no story to tell. And so what I've done a lot is written a piece and given them a story. And then I've gone back to them and said, look, you didn't give me anything. So here's what I've written for you. Are you okay with that? And I can't remember a single one who hasn't said, yeah, great. Okay, we'll take that. But I'll go back to your question, David. I don't know that truth and fiction are different things. Truth is stranger than fiction, but I do think there's a responsibility in writing fiction not to stretch things too much, and that's why I didn't have that Hollywood ending in Geraldine, because it would have been a distraction. Because there would have been people in if I were reading it, I would have gone, oh no, sorry, I'm putting this book down now because that's a step too far. That could never happen. And you just broke the relationship with me, so I left it out. But I think that truth and fiction are one and the same thing. Some people write non-fiction. Well, that's rubbish because they're making stuff up just the same as I made stuff up, and just the same as you make stuff up. And there's a beauty in that because the art of making it compelling is making it feel real. And making it feel real, I think, is about writing something that people can see themselves in. And what I tried to do with Geraldine was write a book that is totally different to anything that most other people would have read, but one where they can put it down and go, oh, I saw myself in that. And to know that they're part of this world that they, before they started reading it, they thought was a bit weird and outside their experience.
Andrea, I asked you to pick a section to read to us. I think this is a perfect moment because it really ties into what we're talking about. So, is it going to be the very beginning?
I'm going to start at the beginning
Yeah,
because
very.
oh, actually, no. I've changed my mind now. So you're going to have to put up with me flipping through pages and finding the right page.
That's all right. It's
I'm going to start at the beginning of Geraldine's life in Australia,
okay.
rather than the beginning, which is chapter 51 for those reading along at home, page 216.
216.
Yep, page 216. So, and look, forgive me, those people who, I don't know. I find reading my own work really weird. And there's actually been a lot of time when I haven't been able to read Geraldine without feeling very emotional and maybe crying. So if I start to cry, don't worry, it's okay. I don't think I will tonight, but we'll see. So Geraldine arrived in Australia in November 1981 with a habit and no supply. She'd hidden a handful of cannabis seeds in the patch on the leg of her jeans, but just before they landed in Kuala Lumpur, she chickened out, visiting the toilet and digging out the small greenish-brown balls and swallowing them. She returned to her seat by the window, Grace sitting in the middle, Frank on the aisle, and looked out as the lights on the ground got larger with the plane's descent. She was worried about her estrogen. In the end, she decided to bring only one packet with her, reasoning that she could explain it away if she was quizzed about it, but still worried whether at 17 she could be tried as an adult if she was busted. As was their way, Frank and Grace had given little notice of the move. Frank came home on a break from his contract work in Libya in early October and said he wasn't due to return until next year. This time around, his presence in the house did little to disturb Geraldine's life as she continued to come and go as she pleased, most evenings timing her return home for after she knew her parents would be in bed. This night, she found Frank and Grace up late in the lounge room. Geraldine contemplated going straight up to her room, but decided this would likely raise more questions than her dilated pupils and jittery legs. So she opened the sliding door to the lounge just enough to pop her head through. Night, said Geraldine. Hang on, said Frank. We need to talk to you. Oh, said Geraldine, opening the door just enough for her to slip through, adrenaline tugging at her shoulder joints on its way to her arms. Geraldine stood just inside the doorway to the lounge room, having no intention of sitting down. Frank seemed to understand, so he turned and spoke to Geraldine from his lounge chair, head extended around its wing. We're going to Australia, he said. Oh, said Geraldine, relieved that this was all the news was. See you when you get back. No, said Frank, we're going there to live. Oh, said Geraldine, I'll see you sometime then. Geraldine began calculating what life would be like without Frank and Grace. She'd have to find somewhere to live, but apart from that, she didn't think things would be much different. No, said Frank, you're coming with us. Geraldine ceased her calculations. No, I'm not, she fired back. You are, said Frank. You're coming with us. When are you going? Said Geraldine, not acknowledging that she was part of Frank and Grace's plans just yet. 2 weeks, said Frank. That'll do.
Thank you.
Enough? Is that enough?
Absolutely. And I think that I had a question as well about your dialogue, that snappiness to the dialogue, that naturalism was, do you enjoy writing dialogue? Was the ear for it?
That's a really interesting question because I've written forever, right?
Mm.
I've got my first novel tucked away in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet behind me, never to see the light of day.
I got one too.
And I think we all have. At least. And I always felt like I struggled with dialogue, and I used to listen to people and think, am I getting the voices right? Am I getting the rhythm of the language right? And so when I was writing Geraldine, I thought, and a lot of it is dialogue based. I don't do a lot of describing of things. I don't do a lot of describing of people because I want these to be images that give the reader plenty of room. And it's really interesting because people have said, I can picture this really clearly. And I'm thinking, okay, that's good because you're bringing yourself to the story because I never described what you're telling me you've read, which is brilliant. That's where I think the magic of reading lies. But the dialogue itself is deliberately really clipped because that's the way, particularly family, particularly Yorkshire people speak anyway, or often do. But also because, and again, I'll go back to Ken Loach and films and that kitchen sink type thing, the dialogue is always so banal in a way, but not really. So it's clipped and it's to the point and it's not flowery. And I think that's worked to the advantage of the story because a lot of it is carried through the dialogue.
Mm.
If it got too flowery, people would be bored, I think. So it needed to be sharp and stark and almost monochrome.
Building on that, music is a massive part.
Yeah.
From the gorgeous cover.
The cover's amazing, isn't it? I think
Really?
it's a good job.
What did you think when that came through, actually? Well, while we're on the cover.
The second go at the cover, and when Freo sent it through, I thought, this is great.
Yeah.
And it changed much from the first iteration. In fact, the only real change was the toning down of the yellow of the arms because the first iteration was a very Simpsons yellow. And I said, we just back off that. Everything else is pretty much the same. But I did not read the cover the way I think it was intended until I read the draft teaching notes that went along with Geraldine. And the first question is, okay, the cover depicts a woman protecting her modesty with a record in each hand. And I'm like, oh my God, so it does. That's even more amazing now. But I hadn't read that. I just knew I liked it. And it's really eye-catching, and lots of people comment on how fantastic the cover is. And I'm so grateful to the graphic art people at Freo Press for doing such a good job.
It is like an LP cover in a lot of senses.
Yeah.
It is in terms of the story, is the role of music, is that to express those things that cannot be expressed through dialogue, those feelings, because at certain points in the story, music is extremely powerful.
Yeah, and look, I did that because I love music. But that was one of the most challenging things to write about because I've read so many novels and so many stories with references to music, and they just seem kind of slavish and a bit sort of necromantic, if that's a word, and if it actually means what I thought it might mean. But anyway, they're a bit bloodsuckery. They're living off other people's art. And I wanted to show people music through Geraldine's eyes. and her commitment to and her transformation by her consumption of music and her engagement in the creation of music and staging music. I also wanted it to be a central part of the novel because there is a strong expression of diversity through music and musicians, and every story that's ever wanted to be told has been captured in a 3-minute pop song that we sort of kind of see as throwaway, but they're incredibly meaningful, and incredibly articulate and say so much with so few words. And the other thing is that I was inspired by people in my own life, people who are amongst my group of friends, and my colleagues, to draw on them for some of the characters. So Janine, who goes on to win an ARIA, and is this amazing, powerful female performer, is based in large part on a local artist that I work with. Who when I wrote Janine, I had this young woman in my mind's eye, and her strength and capability as a performer and her magnetism informed that character. So I had a lot to draw on, but I tried to do it really carefully. So again, spoiler alert, but in the early stages when Geraldine and Harry go to see the Jam,
Yes,
I needed to try to show how visceral, I think that's the right word. I'm using long words now. I should stop doing that. Show how immediate and impactful and dangerous and heightening of awareness that show was, without slavishly saying, she went to see the Jam and they played some songs and the crowd cheered and blah, 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 blah. I tried to capture the essence of that night and the danger and the excitement of it without being too slavish. And I really hope that I did that because it was important that I wrote those scenes in without sort of, stealing from the artist that I was writing about.
Something that really stood out for me was when Geraldine hears about the Sex Pistols and about punk for the first time, and it's just the parents saying, "Oh, it's just kids spitting on each other," and that's all she kind of knew.
That is literally word for word dialogue that I heard in Zambia.
Wow.
And the irony of it was, I mean, I called Frank and Grace. I based them on my parents. And look, my mum's passed away a long time ago. I don't speak to my father. But I called them Frank because he never was, and I called her Grace because she never had any, right? But they were drunk as because that's what you do. You drink and smoke, and then you don't condone people for using other substances to help them get through their lives.
Yeah.
But that was literally word for word a conversation that I heard my parents having with their neighbours or friends or whatever about, oh, isn't it terrible? They blah 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 while they're knocking back the beer and the wine.
But if you actually went to the Sex Pistols show, you'd probably have a good time. Like if you actually, it's judging things from a distance. But if you actually,
well, look, I never saw them back in the day, but I did see them in '96 when they played the Entertainment Centre, and they still had that energy and violence and anger and beauty, and God, it was a good show. So yeah, I would love to have seen them in the early days, but they were frightening. The descriptions of them were frightening, and it was that sort of fear that attracted, because there was something, just hyper real about that era and that sort of type of music.
Andrea, there's a Spotify playlist, which you can get through the Fremantle Press website, but there's lots of questions in the chat. So Bradley Rayner is saying, thank you for introducing me to different music. I was on Spotify as I was listening to Television Marquee Moon. Moon. It was instant, but Geraldine had to wait weeks and months for her magazines and records. We are so spoiled now with the instant, no anticipation. Was it conjuring up that different time?
Yeah. And look, you'd get your weekly fix through New Musical Express and Sounds Magazine and Melody Maker. So it was a weekly thing. But I actually don't know how news and gossip spread about new bands because it was almost telepathic. So you would read those things, but somehow, there was this word of mouth that is now amplified through the internet. So it's still there. and we have this deluge of new content, whereas there was, less content in those days. I don't know if times are better or worse now. I don't like to sort of feel like, things are better or worse. A lot of people say to me, oh, no one makes any good music anymore these days. It was better back in, whenever. I don't believe that. I don't subscribe to that. I think the music that's being made today is just as good as we're judging it from old eyes, my generation. But I love discovering new music still. That's why I love, the WA music scene, because you can go out any night of the week and walk into a live music venue and you will see world-class original music and you'll be like, wow, these people live in our town and they're like, you can most of the time get in for free to go and see them and they're playing that stuff. I love discovering new. Yeah. I don't know. What was the question? Did I answer the question? I'm not sure I remember the question.
No, I want it. We've got 15 minutes left somehow.
Yeah.
Absolutely clattered along. So if you've got any more questions for Andrew, please jump in the chat. There's some great ones there. I'm doing my best to get to them. But I wanted to sort of swing to politics
Yeah.
because maybe the last half of the book, this is when Geraldine starts to get into rights and into fighting for recognition, but particularly against the Gender Reassignment Act,
Yeah.
2000. Now,
Yeah.
you say in the author's note and acknowledgements, you'd like to thank the editor of the book, Seth Malakari. In the
Yeah.
early parts of Geraldine, I deliberately referenced some ideas, but I went away from that a little bit with Seth's advice. Can you tell us a little bit about that process? Because you do really dive into things, and it's a very extraordinary passage. I learned things I genuinely did not know, and I was a
Yeah.
journalist.
Yeah. Look, Seth saved me from one particular scene and one particular conversation that I'm actually not going to talk about tonight because I will talk about it at some time in the future. But I said something very controversial about the process of transition. And, at the early part of this conversation, I talked about, transition's a bit of a myth. And I really believe that. There are stages that people go through, of course, but you're always who you are. You might evolve, and people do evolve in their understanding of selves. Some of us come fully formed, some of us learn along the way, but we're all who we are. And this idea that, people go through and have to go through this process of transition, and somehow a doctor has to intervene, and there has to be this and there has to be that. And, when you think about it, and I will say this, most of the idea of what it means to be a transgender person has come out of the thinking and the reasoning of cis males. And so when I had to, because I started in the time that it was illegal to be myself, had to get the approval of a psychiatrist to be able to be publicly myself. Who did I go and see? Who was the leading expert in Perth? It was a cis male who then, after a session with me, basically said, you don't pass my test of what it means to be a woman. And that was devastating. I was like, whoa, that set me back for a decade, back into myself. And then reflecting on it now, I think, how dare you even think that you could determine and dictate who I am from your worldview, no matter how much research you've done, no matter how many degrees you've got, no matter how long you practice medicine for, you do not know. You're not expert in being me. So the idea of, gender law reform is even now, and I think I said in the author's notes, the fight continues, something like that, because it does. And around 2 weeks ago, the government enacted a law that was passed through Parliament toward the end of last week that replaces the Gender Reassignment Board. And lots of people in the trans and queer community are celebrating that as progress. But what it still does is discriminate against gender diverse people by forcing them to have what is called in the legislation clinical treatment for an illness that doesn't exist. And that's the government's compromise to, parts of their party that tut about gender diverse people. Oh, that will, and we've got to protect ourselves from them. And in fact, in announcing the laws in April last year, the now former Attorney General likened gender diverse women to male sex criminals in the media. in the media conference announcing the changes as a way of softening the blow of saying, so we're going to continue to legislate in a way that discriminates against you. And so I rail against that. I rail against the idea that I should be treated in any way differently. And I should be forced to, or other people should be forced to go by law to do things to claim who they are because somehow, people need to be kept safe from us. I don't know. I'm the least dangerous person in some ways you could ever want to meet. I was really deeply hurt when the Attorney General likened gender diverse people to male sex criminals. And then when the government passed a law that discriminates against gender diverse people and says, here is a barrier you have to access, go through, if you want to be recognized legally, like those people whose gender does match what they were assigned at birth. It's just wrong. And the fact that we accept it, even as a queer community, whatever that is I can't figure out why we do that. I can't figure out why we should be being told it's something to celebrate or something to accept, because it's not. It will lead to more self-harm, more loss of life. And then society says, oh, well, you were weird and strange anyway, so it's your fault that you weren't, that you couldn't sustain your life, when it's actually society's fault. Wow, that got really heavy. Let's do something fun now.
I wanted to ask just on the back of that, working with Seth and also working with Georgia. Seth, they were recently shortlisted for the Fogarty, I think it was.
The Fogarty Award, which was, a real credit and an acknowledgement of their, power as a writer. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we also share an editor. Georgia Richter was my editor at Freo Press.
Indeed, yeah.
So having support like that and a publisher like Freo Press backing you in publishing Geraldine, what's it been like to bring the book out? To be, you've gone over the parapet, if you will.
I know.
You're in the arena. You're in this arena.
Yeah, and look, it's been a really interesting and wonderful and strange and challenging and confronting experience. Mostly wonderful. And I think the challenges and the confrontation come from within myself because, in writing Geraldine and then putting it out to the world, or, to the portion of the world that is paying attention, I've actually exposed quite a bit of myself. And for a while I thought, oh no, what have I done? What have I done? And I thought, no, I need to back away from this. I'm not sure I can own it. And then someone, a friend, another writer said, oh, but you can't back away from this. Geraldine's a love letter to yourself. And I took those words and I turned around and I thought, okay, I can do this. I can be the person who wrote the book, and I can talk about it in terms of, the fun stuff as well as the difficult stuff. And I can be honest about my own life and my own existence alongside that, because I think there's value in doing that for society in general, not only because they get to read a really awesome book, though I say so myself, but because they get to read a book where they think, wow, I didn't know that. And golly, aren't these people just ordinary, just like me? But the bigger thing that comes from that is, aren't we all actually extraordinary? And I think it's wonderful that we can see ourselves that way. And I hope that people take away that from Geraldine, like, wow, she was just normal, but look at these things she did. And then, oh, hang on a second, I've done some pretty extraordinary things too. Maybe I am equally extraordinary. My existence is equally amazing, because that's all of our existences.
I was told when bringing a book out, probably the most enjoyable part is the stories you'll then get told by readers.
Yeah.
We have talked about what you hope people take away from the book, but what have people given to you since Geraldine?
Look, I have had quite a few people, and I think some of them, were on the chat. But I think the first question reflects this. But I've had people come to me in person and online when I've been talking about Geraldine and say, look, I feel more like I can be me now that I know that, this story. And boy, that heartens me so much. And it's not only, gender diverse or queer people who say that. It's just people. And
Yeah.
I really don't like the way that we sort of try to categorize. We're just people, but people draw somehow strength and the idea that it's okay to be honest and true to themselves, and that in fact that's our only job in this existence, is to be true to ourselves and to find that truth and then to live that truth. And I've had people say that to me in various ways, and boy, does that touch my heart. I love that so much.
Andrew, I wanted to read a comment to you as well. It's from Sarah David to
Yeah.
everyone. It says, as the book came to a close, I was struck by the simplicity of the ending. After everything that transpired and all she achieved, the beauty of just being felt like the pinnacle of life. I cried from happiness and a relief that I connected so strongly with this desire. And then the question, I would like to know at what point in Andrea's process where she knew how the story would close out.
Yeah, look, okay, I won't wax too lyrical about this because we don't have a lot of time left. The first draft of Geraldine, the first chapter, in the first draft, Geraldine died in a banal domestic accident in her bedroom. She died alone and lonely, and she lay dead in her bedroom for long enough that her dogs decided they had to eat her because they were hungry. And when I tell that, people either laugh or they're horrified. It never ceases to provoke a reaction. So I've got to use that somewhere else at some point. But by the time Geraldine had taken over the process of writing the story, because I intended to write something very different to the story that became the published book, Geraldine needed a happy ending. Geraldine needed, and I needed the story to end in that simple, simple way. I didn't want to, sort of say Geraldine lived happily ever after, either in those few words or in, several chapters. I just needed her to be able to go and for people to be able to imagine, what life she's living now with Steph, who is based on a beautiful, beautiful woman in my life who gave life to Steph and loves, loves, loves Jimmy Barnes. And so, again, I drew from my own life and the beautiful people who I have in my life who love and care about me. I did a little sort of Geraldine takeover of my social media over the last little while. And the first one that Geraldine posted I typed for her, but she posted it, was, oh yeah, hey, Steph and I are now retired to a little town down south. There's a little bit of sort of like curiosity when we went there, but Steph's joined the CWA and I run a local radio show. And when musos come to town, we have friends over for music and meals. And then I added a little thing, which is actually a throwback to where the book originally began and just doesn't go there. Because I said, oh, and, people maybe will get a little bit sort of more sort of heightened awareness when I start offering to run BDSM workshops with the local mistress.
Yeah, that's
That
great.
brings me no end, because that's where the book was beginning to head in terms of it being an exploration of Geraldine's evolution through the expression and the multiple expressions of her sexuality. But Geraldine said, yeah, no, we're not writing that story. Thanks very much. So I might save that for another time.
Well, Andrew, you've been so generous in your answers, and I really, really appreciate your time tonight, and for humoring me and answering everybody's questions in the chat. I sort of somehow we've gone through an hour. I say we need 2 hours for Libby, but now that a lot of people have come to the end of reading Geraldine, is there any other books that you can recommend they pick up next? Is there anything on your nightstand that you're particularly enjoying or getting inspiration from, or where do you think people should go?
Wow. That's a question I really feel unqualified to answer. On my nightstand is quite an old book. It was a Miles Franklin winner by an Australian writer called David Ireland, and it's called A Woman of the Future. And I remember reading it in, God, I'm going to say the 80s, and I loved it. And I actually picked it up to read it again recently, and I haven't, but I've dipped into it. Um, I don't know whether he actually had a right to write that book. as a male. I'm a bit conflicted about that, but boy, it was good and it was strong and it was amazing. Um, but I really don't know. I really don't know where I would sort of direct people to, because my sort of notion of what's good lives very much in the past still. And so I'm catching up now with Frio Press writers. I most recently read Lisa Ellery's
Oh,
first book,
yeah,
Private Prosecution, which is a crime novel, and I loved it.
this is great. Yeah.
I'm reading, golly, oh, I'm so bad with names, but I'm reading, oh, it's set in Fremantle, historical novel. Help me out, because it's another Frio Press writer. Please, please, please.
It's not David Wilson.
Oh, not David's. It's set in the early days around the Second World War in Fremantle. And
Emily Paul, distance,
yeah,
distance
Emily,
between.
thank
Yeah.
you. Distance
Yes,
between
that's Emily Paul's Distance Between
Emma.
Dreams is going to
Yeah,
be
it
months
is
for the book club.
fabulous.
It's
It
great.
is
Yeah.
fabulous. But
Yeah.
look, I couldn't. If your question is around where do people go to learn more about, sort of diversity and gender and stuff like that, I don't know. I really don't, because my view is my view of the world and it's different to everyone else's. So, there are things out there that I have reacted very strongly against, and I'm not going to mention what and whose. And there are things out there that I love, but that's just my opinion. And I would hate to think that I was influencing people about what they should and shouldn't read. That's not my job.
So, but then we'll say your next book, Emily Paul's.
Yeah,
Uh,
look, Distance Between Dreams is fabulous. It is so beautifully written. I started reading it and thought, oh no, this is so good. And Geraldine's so
Bloody
bare
good.
bones and bland. And Private Prosecution was another one. Again, it just gripped me, but it was this beautiful sort of drawing in. And then there's this misogynistic character. And I said to Lisa, how could you write such a nasty misogynist? You're a woman, for goodness sake. And she's like, oh, yeah, well, so, so well. So there are some, again, I'm going to go local. Pick up a book by a local author and you will not go wrong. We produce art as good as anywhere you'll find in the world, right here in Perth, right here in WA. And, we really should be consuming it in large quantities because it is really, really good. So there you go. If you want to read something new, pick up a local author.
And speaking of local authors,
Yeah.
Andrea, thank you very much for coming on the Libby Book Club for WA for this month with your fantastic book, Geraldine. Congratulations. It's an absolute triumph. It was really great to have you on the show. And I reckon Sarah David's comment slash question on the
Yep.
ending, I reckon what do you reckon? Is that?
Let's go there. I love that. I love that. So I will address it, Sarah, to you. And having learned now from David, I will date it and say, I came from the Living Book Club, and I will put a message of enduring love in there for you as well, because that's what Geraldine's all about, enduring love. So, yeah.
Sarah, I've put my email address in the chat there, daveallenpatali@gmail.com. Just get in touch with me and I'll link you up with the Libby crew and they can get it sent out to you. So thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. It's actually just started raining here. I can hear it pounding
Yeah.
on the roof here. So a wonderful night to read. Andrea, thank you so much. And
Oh, thank you. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thanks for the questions. And thank you also, look, most of all, of course, to the people online. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to every comment. I would love to spend all night doing this because, wow, what an amazing thing. I hope people have enjoyed it. And I also want to say thank you to Julianne and to the State Library of WA for providing this opportunity. It's so good to be able to engage with and talk to people about my little book, Geraldine. And if you haven't read it, or if you have read it, spread the word of mouth, tell people. Yeah, please do.
thank you, Andrea. And thank you, everybody. Good night. See you later.
Thank you all.
Bye.